What if the weakest planet in the galaxy was actually the deadliest? What if an armada that had never lost a single battle sailed toward Earth, expecting an easy slaughter, and simply ceased to exist? No wreckage, no distress signal, no explosion lighting up the void. Just silence. That silence is where our story begins. Supreme Commander Thrall had never known defeat. In 40 campaigns across 40 worlds, the Draconian expansion fleet had never failed to break a planet's will. Cities burned, governments fell, species surrendered before the first wave of troops even touched soil. Thrall's name was spoken across the Empire the way conquerors are spoken of, with fear, with reverence, and with the quiet certainty that his fleet was unstoppable. He had built that reputation ship by ship, world by world, over 3 decades of relentless expansion, and he wore the way other commanders wore their medals, as proof that resistance was always, eventually, futile. So when Draconian scouts identified a small, blue world on the edge of a minor system, a world called Earth, Thrall barely looked up from his command chair. The planet's technology readings were laughably primitive. Radio chatter, crude satellites, no visible orbital defenses, no fleet presence, nothing that resembled a military deterrent. By every metric his war college had ever taught him, Earth was not a threat. It was a formality, a line item to be checked off before moving on to the next campaign. Log it as Conquest 41, Thrall told his first officer, not bothering to hide his boredom. Will be done by nightfall their time. His officers laughed. Even his tacticians, usually cautious to a fault, saw no reason to prepare contingencies. Why would they? Earth hadn't even developed weapons capable of reaching low orbit, let alone anything that could threaten a war fleet forged in the fires of 40 conquests. The fleet entered Earth's upper atmosphere in perfect formation, 12 heavy cruisers leading the vanguard, their hulls scorched black from 1,000 campaigns, their weapons already primed to begin the traditional first strike, a demonstration of force meant to break enemy morale. Before a single soldier landed, Thrall gave the order himself, savoring the familiar rhythm of a campaign about to begin. The cruisers fired. And then, mid-motion, they were gone. Not destroyed. Not damaged. Gone. One moment, 12 warships filled the tactical display, their weapons blazing toward the surface below. The next moment, the display was empty air, as if the ships had never been built, never been launched, never existed at all. No explosion. No debris field. No energy signature marking their end. The screen simply stopped showing them, as cleanly as if someone had reached in and erased a line from a record no one else remembered writing. Thrall's bridge crew froze. Sensor officers frantically recalibrated their instruments, certain the equipment itself had failed. It hadn't. Long-range scans, short-range scans, thermal imaging, gravimetric mapping. Every system agreed on the same impossible conclusion. 12 of the deadliest warships in Draconian history had simply stopped being real, and no instrument on the bridge could explain how or why, or where they had gone. Recall the second wave. Thrall snapped, his composure fracturing for the first time in decades. Full defensive posture. No one enters atmosphere until we understand what just happened. It was already too late. Panic does not spread through a fleet of hardened conquerors easily, but it spreads fast once it starts. As Thrall scrambled to make sense of the first disappearance, 20 more ships pushed forward on standing orders, unaware the recall command hadn't reached them in time. They too crossed the same invisible threshold above the planet's surface. They too vanished. Then came the reports of entire squadrons losing contact. Not damaged, not retreating. Simply erased from every scope, every channel, every record, as if the void itself had reached up and swallowed them whole. Thrall stood in the center of his bridge, staring at a tactical map that was rapidly emptying of his own fleet, watching decades of unbroken victory dissolve in real time, and felt something he had never allowed himself to feel in 40 years of conquest. Fear. Somewhere below him, on a planet his empire had dismissed as primitive and defenseless. Something ancient was watching, something patient, something that had been waiting, perhaps for centuries, perhaps far longer, for exactly this moment. His officers looked to him for orders, for reassurance, for the calm certainty he had always projected. For the first time, Thrall had none to give. Behind him, On the observation deck, junior officers who had joined the fleet expecting glory instead found themselves whispering old superstitions half remembered from childhood. Stories of worlds that swallowed invaders whole, dismissed the generations as nothing more than campfire tales meant to frighten cadets. No one was laughing at those stories now. The bridge, usually filled with the crisp confidence of a fleet accustomed to winning, had gone eerily quiet. Every officer suddenly unwilling to be the one who suggested pressing forward. Thrall forced himself to think clearly. 40 conquered worlds had taught him that fear was the first thing an enemy tried to exploit, and the first thing a commander needed to master in himself before he could master anything else. He straightened in his chair, buried the tremor in his voice, and gave the only order that still made sense. Hold position, gather data, and above all, do not send another ship past that unseen boundary until they understood exactly what it was. It was a sound decision. It came far too late to matter, and Thrall was about to discover that Earth had never needed weapons to defend itself. It had something far older and far more terrifying than anything his empire had ever built, and it had only just begun to show its hand. Imagine realizing too late that the primitive planet you came to conquer had been studying your kind for centuries before you ever arrived. That was the moment Supreme Commander Thrall faced next, and there was no undoing it. With more than 30 ships erased from existence in under an hour, Thrall made the only decision his instincts allowed: full retreat. He ordered the remaining fleet to reverse course, to pull back beyond the atmosphere, to abandon the invasion before another vessel was lost. It was the first retreat order he had given in his entire military career, and it tasted like ash in his mouth. Every survival instinct screamed at him that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Not with his fleet, but with his entire understanding of what this planet was capable of. The ships tried to comply. They couldn't. As the surviving cruisers attempted to break orbit, their sensors detected something forming around the planet. Not a wall, not a shield in any conventional sense, but shimmering distortion in the fabric of space itself, expanding outward from Earth's surface like ripples on water, slow and deliberate and utterly inescapable. Thrall science officers threw every scanning protocol they had at the phenomenon and came back with the same unsettling answer each time. This was not weapons technology. This was something that manipulated space itself, bending and folding it the way a hand might fold paper, patiently closing around every ship still caught inside its boundary. "It's not attacking us," one officer said, her voice trembling as she stared at the readings. "It's containing us, like we're being sealed inside something." Thrall ordered every remaining channel opened, desperate to intercept any human transmission that might explain what they were facing. What came back was chaos. Overlapping radio signals, television broadcasts, digital noise, a cacophony of the species that appeared to have no unified command structure, no visible military coordination. Nothing that looked like the source of the power currently erasing his fleet from reality. It made no sense. A civilization this fractured, this disorganized on the surface, should not have been capable of anything close to what he was witnessing. And yet, buried beneath that noise, his instruments picked up something else. Faint energy signatures, ancient in origin, radiating up from deep beneath the North American continent, specifically from beneath a mountain range humans called the Rockies. The signal was old, older than the Draconian Empire itself, older, perhaps, than most civilizations currently active in the galaxy, humming with a kind of quiet, patient power that made his sensor readings tremble at the edges. Thrall realized, with dawning horror, that humanity's primitive surface culture was nothing more than camouflage, a chaotic, distracting shell wrapped around something far older and far more dangerous. Beneath it lay technology the Draconians had never encountered in 40 conquered worlds. Technology that predated their own species' arrival among the stars. Technology built by hands that were never human at all. His communications officer, pale and shaking, kept trying to filter the ancient signal from the noise, hoping to extract something resembling a language, a pattern, anything that might be reasoned with. All she found was a rhythm, steady, deliberate, patient in a way that felt less like a machine and more like something that had simply been waiting, undisturbed, for longer than her mind was prepared to comprehend. She reported this to Thrall in a voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking any louder might somehow draw its attention. The distortion field around Earth continued to expand. And one by one, more ships crossed his threshold and disappeared, not violently, but silently, the way a candle flame gives way to darkness without struggle or protest. Thrall watched his flagship's tactical displays shrink from a full invasion fleet to a handful of surviving vessels, and understood, at last, that he had led his empire's most celebrated fleet directly into a trap that had likely been prepared before his ancestors were even born, waiting patiently across the centuries for exactly this kind of arrogance to arrive. There was no escape route, no countermeasure, no weapon in the Draconian arsenal capable of piercing a field that didn't destroy ships, but simply remove them from existence, as though rewriting the universe to say they had never been there at all, as if the very concept of the Draconian expansion fleet arriving at Earth was being quietly, methodically edited out of reality. Thrall gripped the edge of his command chair, watching the expanding field close and around his last remaining ships, and for the first time in his life, Supreme Commander Thrall understood what it felt like to face an enemy he could not outfight, outmaneuver, or outthink. Every instinct that had carried him through 40 victorious campaigns was useless here. Then, across every screen on his bridge, a single human voice broke through the static, calm, measured, and utterly unafraid. Around him, his surviving officers stared at their own instruments, as though the numbers might change if they simply looked hard enough. A tactical officer who had served with Thrall for 11 years, through victories on worlds whose names he could still recite without thinking, found he could not make himself speak. There was no protocol for this. No chapter in any Draconian war manual addressed what a commander was supposed to do when the enemy hadn't fired a single weapon and had still won completely. Earth was about to speak for the first time, and what it said would change the galaxy forever. What kind of civilization greets an alien invasion fleet not with panic, but with the calm of someone who has done this 1,000 times before? That question was about to be answered, and the answer would terrify an empire. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in a command center built into solid stone long before most nations on the surface even existed in their current form, General Helena Vance watched the same tactical display Thrall was watching, except from the opposite side. Rows of monitors tracked the Draconian fleet's positions, their diminishing numbers, and the slow, steady expansion of the containment field surrounding the planet. She had trained for this moment her entire career, inheriting a duty passed down through generations of officers who knew a truth the rest of humanity never had to carry, that Earth had faced this exact scenario before and had always survived it. Vance keyed opened a direct channel to the Draconian flagship, her voice cutting through the chaos of Thrall's bridge with unnerving calm. "Supreme Commander Thrall," she said, as though addressing an old acquaintance rather than an invading warlord, "you are not being attacked. You are being contained. If you wish to understand why, I suggest you stop firing and start listening." Thrall, stripped of every tactical advantage he had ever relied upon, staring at a fleet reduced to a fraction of its former strength, had no choice but to listen. Vance explained what the Draconian sensors had already hinted at. Earth's true defense was not a weapon built by humanity, but an inheritance, a colossal system left behind by a civilization that predated recorded human history, a species that had once served, in Vance's words, as the jailers of the galaxy. Their purpose had never been conquest. It had been containment, trapping dangerous forces, dangerous fleets, dangerous ambitions, and sealing them away in a place where they could never threaten another world again, a role humanity had inherited without ever fully choosing it. "We didn't build this system," Vance continued, her voice steady. "We inherited it, and for thousands of years we have maintained it, understood it just enough to operate it, and use it exactly once before today for its intended purpose, protecting this world from exactly the kind of invasion you attempted this morning." She gestured, and the display shifted to show the true nature of the ships that had vanished, not destroyed, but transported, siphoned to an endless pocket dimension where they drifted, intact but powerless, cut off from every star, every signal, every hope of return, forever. She did not explain everything. There were things about the system beneath the mountains that even her own government had chosen never to make public, records suggesting the vanished civilization had not built this defense out of kindness alone, but out of necessity, as though something they themselves had once feared might still be listening somewhere out among the stars. Vance kept that part to herself. Thrall had enough to process for one conversation. "Your ships are not dead," Vance said, without malice, almost with something resembling regret. They are simply gone. Permanently. And unless you want to join them, Supreme Commander, I suggest you take what remains of your fleet and leave while that choice is still yours to make. Thrall, a man who had never once bowed to another power in his life, felt the full weight of his helplessness settle over him like a physical thing. He had no counter to an enemy that didn't fight, didn't gloat, and didn't even seem interested in destroying him, only in making certain he never threatened Earth again. Every instinct told him to fight. Every fragment of evidence told him fighting would only add his name and his remaining ships to the list of commanders swallowed by that silent, expanding field. He gave the order to withdraw his remaining ships. Vance watched him go without triumph, without celebration, only the quiet, practiced relief of someone who had just successfully done her job for what was, to her knowledge, only the second time in recorded history that a foreign fleet had needed to be turned away in this manner. But she also knew something Thrall didn't yet understand as his ships limped back toward the edge of the system. Leaving Earth alive was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much larger one, and the hardest part of her job was still ahead of her, because Thrall was about to return home carrying a warning the Draconian Empire would refuse to believe, and that refusal would cost them far more than the 32 ships they had already lost. Van stayed in the command center long after the last Draconian ship broke orbit and vanished from her own screens, this time by ordinary means. Engines, trajectory, the mundane physics of retreat rather than the ancient physics of erasure. She had rehearsed this scenario 100 times in training simulations, but living through it left a different kind of weight behind. Somewhere in the archives above her, sealed records detailed the only other time in recorded memory the system had been used in earnest, centuries earlier, against a threat history had chosen to forget rather than remember. She wondered, standing there in the quiet hum of ancient machinery, whether Thrall's empire would prove wiser than that forgotten enemy had been. She already suspected she knew the answer. What happens when the most powerful empire in the galaxy receives a warning it refuses to believe? Supreme Commander Thrall was about to find out, and the answer would nearly destroy everything he had spent his life building. Thrall returned to Draconian space a broken man in all but body. He had lost more than 200 souls in 32 warships without firing a single shot that landed on an enemy he never even saw. He had faced a force that never showed itself, never negotiated in the traditional sense, and never needed to raise its voice above a calm, measured warning. And now he stood before the High Council, the most powerful governing body in the Empire, tasked with explaining a defeat that defied every principled Draconian military doctrine had ever taught him to expect. Earth's surface technology is a deception, Thrall told the assembled council, his voice steady despite the disbelief already forming on their faces before he had even finished his opening statement. Beneath it lies a defense system inherited from a civilization older than our own, capable of erasing entire fleets from existence without conventional weapons of any kind. I recommend, in the strongest possible terms, that the Empire never again attempt to conquer this world, regardless of how weak it may appear on the surface. Silence followed, then laughter, quiet at first, then open, rippling across the chamber like a wave of contempt aimed squarely at him. "You are telling us," said Councillor Draith, the eldest and most decorated member of the High Council, leaning forward with open scorn, that a species incapable of unifying its own planet under a single government defeated the Draconian expansion fleet using technology it doesn't even understand itself. Thrall tried to explain further. The distortion field, the pocket dimension, General Vance's calm and total command of power beyond their comprehension, the ancient signal humming beneath the Rocky Mountains. But every word only deepened the council's certainty that their most celebrated commander had simply failed, and was now inventing an elaborate excuse to cover his shame. Pride, it turned out, was a far more dangerous enemy than any alien defense system could ever be. The council could not accept that a species they considered beneath them had defeated an empire that had never lost a single campaign in living memory, and no amount of censored data or first-hand testimony was going to change that. Their verdict was swift and merciless. Thrall was stripped of his command, his rank, and his name from official fleet records, erased from the histories almost as thoroughly as his ships had been erased above Earth. In its place, the Council authorized an invasion force 5 times larger than the one Thrall had led. 200 warships, commanded by a new officer eager to erase the embarrassment of Earth from Draconian history and prove, once and for all, that no defense, ancient or otherwise, could withstand the full might of the Empire when applied at sufficient scale. The new commander, a decorated but untested officer named Vex, accepted the assignment with open enthusiasm, treating it less like a warning to be heeded and more like an opportunity to be seized. He requested and received 3 times the standard munitions allocation, along with full authority to bombard the surface the moment his fleet cleared the same atmospheric threshold that had swallowed Thrall's ship's whole. Where Thrall had approached Earth with the casual confidence of routine conquest, Vex approached it with something closer to hunger, determined to be remembered as a commander who succeeded where a disgraced predecessor had failed. Thrall watched in the shadows of a chamber he was no longer welcome in as the new fleet was assembled, a force so large it darkened the shipyards for kilometers, built on nothing but wounded pride and the arrogant certainty that overwhelming numbers could solve a problem that had nothing to do with numbers at all. He tried one final time to warn the new commander privately, quietly, away from the council's judgmental ears, hoping that one honest conversation might succeed where his official report had failed. He was ignored, dismissed with the same contempt the council had shown him. As the massive fleet prepared to depart for Earth, Thrall understood, with a bitter, hollow clarity, that his empire was about to repeat his exact mistake, only at a scale that would make the coming disaster impossible to hide, impossible to dismiss, and impossible for the rest of the galaxy to ignore once word inevitably spread. 200 warships were about to learn the same lesson 32 had already paid for in silence. And this time, the entire galaxy would be watching. In the days before the new fleet's departure, Thrall wandered the outer docks alone, no longer welcome among the officers who had once saluted him without hesitation. He watched supply crews load munitions onto ships that would never need them, watched proud young pilots board vessels convinced they were about to make history, and said nothing. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been dismissed. He thought, more than once, of finding some way to stow away aboard the flagship himself, to stand beside the new commander when the moment of realization finally came, not for vindication, but so that someone who understood the truth might survive to speak of it afterward. In the end, he did not go. He simply watched the fleet depart, and waited, the way a man waits for a storm he has already seen coming from a great distance. What happens when an empire's greatest humiliation becomes broadcast to every civilization in the galaxy at once? Earth was about to answer that question, not with force, but with the truth. The second Draconian fleet arrived at Earth with none of Thrall's earlier caution. 200 warships descended to the atmosphere in a show of overwhelming force meant to erase any doubt about Draconian supremacy once and for all. Their new commander, Vex, confident that Thrall's failure had been a fluke born of insufficient firepower rather than a fundamental mismatch of power, ordered an immediate, full-scale assault the moment the fleet crossed into orbit. For a few brief minutes, it almost looked like arrogance might be rewarded. The first waves pressed deep into the atmosphere without incident. Weapon systems charging, ground-based targeting arrays locking onto cities Vex intended to make examples of. His bridge crew allowed themselves a flicker of premature celebration, certain that greater numbers had simply overwhelmed whatever had stopped Thrall before. That celebration lasted exactly as long as it took the leading squadrons to cross the same invisible boundary the First Fleet had triggered weeks earlier. The result was identical and immediate. Ship after ship crossed the same invisible threshold above Earth's surface, and ship after ship vanished exactly as the First Fleet had, with the same eerie silence, the same absence of wreckage, the same total erasure from every sense of watching. This time, however, General Vance did not wait for private negotiations behind closed channels. She had watched the Draconian Empire dismiss one warning already, and she understood that quiet diplomacy would only invite a third invasion, and a fourth, each one larger and more destructive than the last, until eventually one might succeed in ways she couldn't yet predict. So instead, she opened a channel to every monitored frequency across known space, a broadcast designed to reach not just the Draconian Empire, but every civilization capable of receiving it, deliberately and permanently ending humanity's centuries of hidden anonymity. To every empire, alliance, and species listening, Vance began, her voice calm but carrying across the stars with unmistakable authority. Earth has defended itself this way for thousands of years. Every fleet that has attempted conquest has met the same fate as the 200 ships currently vanishing above our planet. at this very moment. We do not seek war. We do not seek expansion. We inherited a defense system built by a civilization that came before all of us, and we have used it exactly as it was intended, to protect this world, and only this world, from exactly this kind of aggression. The broadcast included verified censored data, timestamps, and records stretching back further than most galactic archives. Proof, undeniable and public, that Earth's silent power was neither myth nor bluff, neither exaggeration nor propaganda. For the first time, every civilization watching understood that the small, chaotic, seemingly primitive planet at the edge of a minor system was, in truth, untouchable, and had been untouchable for longer than most of their own histories. The Draconian High Council, faced with public humiliation on a galactic-scale broadcast to every rival power they had ever competed with, had no choice but to do what pride had prevented them from doing after Thrall's original warning. They backed down. Emissaries were dispatched not to negotiate surrender, but peace. The first peace treaty the Draconian Empire had ever signed with a species it had originally intended to conquer without a second thought. Even Counselor Draith, the loudest voice mocking Thrall's warning just weeks earlier, was forced to publicly acknowledge that war against Earth was, in every practical sense, unwinnable, and to do so in front of the same chamber that had once laughed him out of the room. Vance watched the peace negotiations unfold with quiet satisfaction, but no real celebration. She understood something the rest of the galaxy hadn't yet grasped. Fear doesn't end conflict. It only delays it and reshapes it into something new. And now that Earth's secret had been broadcast, every listening ear across known space, an entirely new kind of danger had just been set into motion, one that had nothing to do with the Draconian Empire at all, and everything to do with what humanity's revelation had just awakened in everyone else. Because if one hidden civilization had left behind a weapon capable of erasing fleets from existence, it almost certainly wasn't the only one. And somewhere out there, someone else was already asking the same question. Across a dozen star systems, the broadcast played on repeat for days, translated into languages Vance had never heard of, analyzed by scholars and war planners alike who had spent their careers assuming humanity was irrelevant to galactic affairs. Some governments issued formal apologies for past hostilities they had never even acted on, eager to avoid ever being mistaken for a future enemy. Others went quiet entirely, the kind of quiet that worried Vance far more than any public outcry could have. Silence, she had learned long ago, was rarely a sign that a threat had lost interest. More often, it was a sign that a threat had simply started planning more carefully. What if defeating the galaxy's greatest empire wasn't the end of humanity's story, but only the opening chapter of something far more dangerous? That was a question General Vance couldn't shake, even as the ink dried on Earth's first interstellar peace treaty. In the weeks following the broadcast, the galaxy changed in ways no one, not even Vance, had fully anticipated. Earth, once dismissed as a primitive backwater unworthy of serious attention, was suddenly the subject of intense scrutiny from every major power in known space. Diplomats arrived requesting formal audiences. Scholars requested access to records that officially didn't exist. Other empires, wary of provoking a planet capable of erasing entire fleets from reality, began treating humanity's territory with a caution previously reserved only for the galaxy's oldest and most established powers, a strange, unearned respect built entirely on fear. But Vance had access to information the public broadcast never mentioned. Fragments of data, recovered from the ancient system beneath the Rockies, references embedded deep in its original programming to other installations, other containment sites, scattered across systems humanity had never explored and, until now, had never needed to. The system beneath Earth, it turned out, was not unique. It was one node in a much larger network, built by the same vanished civilization, and scattered across worlds no one currently living had ever set foot on, waiting in silence the same way Earth's system had waited for thousands of years. If Earth's defense system was real, then somewhere out there, other forgotten planets might be sitting on technology just as devastating. Technology that no one had yet been foolish enough or desperate enough to activate, but that wouldn't stay hidden forever now that the galaxy knew such things existed at all. Word of this possibility spread quickly, and not everyone reacted with caution. Where some empires backed away from Earth in fear, others turned their attention outward, searching for these rumored sister systems with the same hunger that had once driven the Draconian invasion in the first place. If one forgotten world held power enough to humble the galaxy's greatest fleet, then whoever found and controlled the next one will hold power enough to reshape the balance of the entire galaxy, and that thought alone was enough to launch 100 quiet, desperate expeditions across a dozen empires, each one racing to be the first to claim whatever waited on those forgotten worlds before a rival could get there first. Vance's own analysts flagged 3 candidate systems within the first month alone, based on nothing more than ancient stellar cartography buried in the ruins beneath the Rockies, faint markers left behind by a civilization that had once needed to remember its own network of prisons. She authorized no expeditions of her own. Whatever those sites were guarding, she suspected, deserved to stay forgotten for a while longer, if humanity was wise enough to leave them that way. Vance realized, with a chill she couldn't quite explain to her own command staff, that revealing Earth's secret had solved one problem, while creating a far larger one. Humanity was no longer just a target for conquest. It had become the opening clue in a galaxy-wide search for weapons that predated every empire currently in existence, weapons whose true purpose and full capability no living being, human or otherwise, fully understood. In a quiet, unrecorded moment, Van stood alone in the command center beneath the mountains, staring at the ancient machinery humanity had inherited but never truly mastered, the same machinery that had just reshaped the balance of an entire galaxy in a single afternoon. She thought of Thrall, stripped of rank, dismissed by his own empire, yet the only Draconian who had understood the truth from the very beginning, punished for being right before anyone else was ready to hear it. She wondered how many other Thralls were out there right now, staring at ancient ruins on forgotten worlds, sensing a power they didn't yet understand, and refusing to listen to their own instincts the way the High Council had refused to listen to his. Earth had survived its first true test as a galactic power. But survival, Vance understood, was not the same as safety. The galaxy that had once ignored humanity now watched it closely, some with respect, some with fear, and some, she suspected, with the same hunger that had driven the Draconian invasion in the first place, patiently waiting for the day Earth's guard finally slipped. Humanity had never been the galaxy's weakest civilization. It had been its silent guardian, quietly holding a secret meant to remain buried forever. And now that the secret was out, an era far more dangerous than any single invasion was only just beginning, one where the hunted and the hunter were no longer easy to tell apart. Somewhere beneath the mountains, the ancient system hummed on exactly as it always had, indifferent to treaties, indifferent to fear, indifferent to the sudden, desperate attention of an entire galaxy. It had done its job. It would keep doing its job, for as long as it was needed, whether or not humanity ever fully understood the civilization that built it, or the reasons that civilization had vanished so completely that not even its jailers remembered its name. The prison had been discovered, and somewhere out among the stars, other prisons were waiting to be found.